On the end?
This end.
Uh-huh.
And then,
Yes.
It interferes with mics and the film. As moderator, I have some support in this chair. I'll give her, she'll shut it down. Take it from there. And then we'll just have her give you a 20 minute.
And just tell me when.
Let's see, probably got 10 seconds.
Okay.
Oh, you're on.
All right. Ready? Yeah, if we could all reassemble, we're about to start.
Everybody loves it. Yeah, terrific.
And I'm going to begin. Well, welcome to the next session. And as you see, the title is How Prepared Are We for the Next 9/11? We have a terrific panel to address this issue. We have Senator Hart from the Hart-Rudman Commission that predicted a devastating attack on the Homeland and recommended that the government reorganize itself to prevent it. Richard Ben-Veniste on the 9/11 Commission that investigated the attack that occurred and made recommendations to prevent it from happening in the future. Senator Jim Talent from the latest commission to say that we're still not prepared. And Kochavi as well from the private sector. But to moderate the session, we have Admiral Steve Abbot, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, a private nonprofit aid society dedicated to assisting sailors, Marines, and their families. Until June of 2003, he served as the acting Homeland Security Advisor to the President, having served as the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor under Governor Tom Ridge. Admiral Abbott currently serves as the Chairman of the Advisory Panel on the Department of Defense capabilities for support of civilian authorities after certain incidents. Admiral Abbott.
I'm trying to get them to shorten that to the Abbott-Keating Commission, but it hasn't caught on. Good afternoon. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to lead a discussion with this panel on terrorism preparedness. And I'm going to start by posing a question to our panelists after I provide to you some counterpoints on what is generally known as CBRNE threats, that wonderful acronym CBRNE, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high explosive. And then we're going to use that, hopefully, to cover the territory with respect to terrorism preparedness. So, the chemical threat. Some say that it's likely, actually unlikely, that an attack with a chemical weapon could cause mass casualties, citing Shinriko's sarin attack in Japan in 1995 as an expensive undertaking with few fatalities. While others say that delivery of a persistent agent in an enclosed, densely populated space may kill hundreds, if not thousands, and will certainly cause panic and mass disruption as it did after Aum Shinrikyo. Biological. A senior official from the Department of Homeland Security said recently that a biological attack is one of the 2 top priorities for DHS. But others say that obtaining and delivering a biological agent, one which results in many fatalities, is actually expensive, scientifically challenging, and likely to be beyond the near-term capability of any sub-state terrorist organization. Radiological. It's said that a dirty bomb is unlikely to cause many fatalities or major physical damage. Others say that the long-term contamination from such an attack could make a major metropolitan area virtually uninhabitable for perhaps decades, and the cleanup would be long and exceptionally expensive. The nuclear threat. That same official from DHS said that an improvised nuclear device is the other of DHS's top 2 priorities. But some say that terrorists, for a variety of reasons, are unlikely to be able to obtain, transport, and detonate such a device successfully inside the United States. And finally, high explosives. Many say that we should continue to plan for this most likely attack by terrorists. It's low-tech, relatively inexpensive, and almost always effective, the Christmas Day and Times Square incidents notwithstanding. But others say that terrorists, and especially Al-Qaeda, are looking for something more sophisticated and an attack that will produce results even more dramatic than 9/11. So with that as a background, I'm going to start us down the path of getting to look at those. Before we actually talk about the specific threats, I want to ask this preliminary question of each of the panelists. If you were able to listen to Michael Leiter this morning, especially his remarks about taking down the Al-Qaeda leadership and the apparent lack of progress of terrorist groups in obtaining biological and nuclear capability, you might be convinced that the chance of a major attack on the U.S., especially a WMD attack, is diminished. So my question is, how convinced are you that there will be another major terrorist attack in the U.S., another 9/11? And I'm going to start with Mr. Kochavi.
Thank you. I think we need to look at it in a very broad perspective and not to look at a certain organization, if it's Al-Qaeda or anyone else. First, there is a clear network of communication between terrorist organizations. So even if you look at an organization which you assume that is weak, you have to look at the other organizations which are connected to him, starting with the Hezbollah, which is not that weak. And an organization such as the Hezbollah might say, politically, I cannot confront the US directly, but I definitely can do it through different channels, such as Al-Qaeda, which means you don't always look at the capacity of the organization itself, but the capacity of its network. And that's something which I think is critical to understand. We cannot look at terror as corporate America. They don't work in silos. They have very unique way of thinking. The second thing which is very important, we have to look at countries that support terror. So you might take a very small terror organization which has the right motivation, but has access to amazing technology which was developed by a country that supports terror. So their capacity is not what they are doing in their own labs. Their capacity is what that country is doing in their own labs, and you have to find out if they have a relationship with them. Taking those two in consideration, I think brings me to the understanding that this is something that we should expect and we should prepare.
Thank you. Senator Hart.
Admiral, let me begin as a Coloradan, first of all, if I may, to join Walter Isaacson and all the people at the Aspen Institute in welcoming you all here, particularly those of you who have not visited this community before. I hope you'll take a little time to travel around Aspen and see how average Coloradans live. And you might even go to the airport to see how they commute among their various houses. But this is an extraordinary convention and conference center, and we're very proud of it. I am absolutely convinced there certainly will be other major efforts to disrupt the U.S. economy and injure and kill as many Americans as possible. If you then get into the kind of taxonomy of terrorism the Admiral has outlined, and if you reason backward from the mind of a terrorist, you look for what is the easiest thing to do and could cause the most damage. And I end up at least with the biological threat. I used to say in response to this question in media interviews that the next attack would not be in New York or Los Angeles, it would be in Denver, Cleveland, and Dallas. I had to quit that because I got press inquiries from Cleveland saying, what do you know that we don't know? The point is, even though New Yorkers believe and are best prepared for another attack because they've had this experience, if you want to terrorize Americans, you don't keep hitting New York City. You come to the vulnerable center of this country in multiple targets, and the terrorists themselves become the weapons of mass destruction by voluntarily infecting themselves with highly contagious viruses, going to public events, certainly not a conference such as this, and exposing that virus to as many people as possible. And all the other varieties are certainly possible, but that's the one that concerns me the most.
Thank you. Senator Talent, I know that the Graham Talent Commission actually had a hard date, at least somewhere in its conclusion, so I'm going to presume that you'll get to.
Yeah. I will. I agree with everything Senator Hart said, and I'll give a little history of the commission. We were a follow-on to the 9/11 Commission, which was in a way a follow-on to yours. And Congress in the summer of 2007 wanted us to created this commission and wanted us to answer the question which the 9/11 Commission asked: what happens if the most dangerous people in the world get the most dangerous weapons in the world? How likely is that? What can we do to prevent it, and what happens? And Bob Graham was the chairman of it, and I was the vice chairman of it. And we studied it all through the spring and summer of 2008. My background is more straight Pentagon stuff rather than this. Bob's is in intel, so I really went in a clean slate on this. I had no prejudices one way or another. I knew what people I respected thought about it and how afraid they were of it. Colin Powell, everybody, you, President Obama, everybody was saying this is the nightmare that they're worried about, the intel people. We studied it, interviewed hundreds of people, went all around the world, looked at all the classified data, and reached the conclusion that the possibility of a WMD attack, we focused on nuclear and bio, was growing by the terrorists, was growing, and would reach a probability within 5 years, which is 2013. Now, we don't have intel saying 2013, but the point we were saying was this is a short-term thing. This is not 15 years from now it might happen. There's a substantial chance now, and it is growing. And moreover, we said, what is likely to happen, you have to plan on the assumption will eventually happen unless you change the probabilities or the trends. And it isn't that we're not doing things, and Mr. Leiter's right, the things he's talking about are helpful. But they're not sitting there, and conditions in the world favor them. Now, there were 4 reasons we gave, and I'll go through them very briefly. First, we had direct intel that they're trying to do this. And a lot of this stuff has become public since then. The biolabs that they were running in Afghanistan, they're trying to buy the nuclear materials. So we know they're trying to do this. We have their statements. It fits their tactics. The tactic is to hit vulnerable areas or vulnerable systems or densely populated areas as hard as you can with asymmetric weapons. I mean, what the airplanes that they used in 9/11 were asymmetric weapons. These are weapons that have a far greater destructive impact than the power it takes to develop and deploy them. Okay, the ultimate asymmetric weapon is a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear, bio, any one of these. We know they're trying. We know it fits their tactics. We know they're organizationally capable of doing it. And this, I disagree with one of your preparatory statements. It is not scientifically beyond them at all. I mean, you can isolate. If you recruit the right life scientist, you can develop a bioweapon. Anthrax exists in nature. You can get plague. You can get smallpox around the world. It's easy to smuggle. And you can weaponize it. It's not that difficult. You turn the anthrax or the plague and the anthrax into a dry slurry. You get a pound of it. You get a pickup truck. You put a shell on it. You punch a hole in it, and you drive up and down. And St. Louis will take another city, not New York. 4th of July on the waterfront, blowing it up in the air with a paint sprayer. And you don't even know you've been attacked until a couple of days, and people start getting symptoms. DHS has modeled this in New York, and in the summer you can expose millions of people, and you kill hundreds of thousands of people. So we know they want to, they're trying to, it fits their tactics, it's well within their capabilities, and the opportunities are proliferating, particularly in bio, because of the revolution in life science, which is a good thing. I mean, it's exploding all over the world. And we thought bio a little more likely than nuclear because there are, thank heavens, there are bottlenecks to nuclear. You've got to get the nuclear material, and you've got to eventually, somewhere in the chain, a first world economy, or at least a national economy, has got to be involved in getting the nuclear material. They can buy it, they can steal it, somebody can give it to them, which is what you were mentioning, they can get it, but, so that's harder, and it is a little harder to weaponize. So we thought bio more likely. And just to say this, in saying this, we were careful to say, it isn't that our government isn't trying to stop it. And a lot of people conclude that, well, then we must be totally screwing up. We're going to talk today probably about how we are screwing up, but this is hard. That's the reason they're trying to do it, because they know it's hard to defend against. You know, Churchill said, in war, it's sometimes necessary to take into account the enemy. They're pursuing this because they know it is hard, particularly in a first world society with a federal government structure to stop. So I would agree, and so I can agree with what Mr. Leiter is saying since we are doing things, but I'll just close. Bob Graham, who used to be chairman of the Intel Committee, so he goes on trips all the time. He went on one with Director Panetta, and they re-interviewed all the people, and Bob came back and told me, I can't tell why because it's classified, but he says, if anything, he thinks our estimate was too conservative. And these are serious people saying this.
Richard, is another 9/11
Not exactly
a certainty?
a laugh line, I know. It's,
Yeah, it's not a laugh riot in here right now, is it? I guess to add to this menu of horrible possibilities, I would take a slightly different approach, something that I've worried about from time to time over the years since 9/11, and that is Al-Qaeda's ingenuity for utilizing what's here against us. On 9/11, they utilized to great destructive force the power of commercial airlines filled with fuel, which became flying bombs. I've been concerned about the possibility of attacks against, for example, the transportation of hazardous materials by rail. Chlorine gas, for example, which is transported by CSX on a rail line that runs only blocks from the U.S. Capitol. Think about that. Our nuclear plants are another area of potential disruption. I won't get into the technical stuff. I'm not that facile at it, but you don't have to get to the core of a nuclear plant to cause tremendous, horrendous destruction.
So we clearly have unanimity on the severity of this issue. I'd like to get on to talk some about how we're organized to deal with it. Dwight Eisenhower said that the right organization won't guarantee success, but the wrong one will guarantee failure. And yesterday we heard Secretary Lute discuss the progress that's been made by the Department of Homeland Security over the 7 years or so that it's been in existence. And then at lunch, Fran Townsend mentioned that if she had to do it over again, she might re-engineer some of it. Senator Hart, I know you looked at this early on, and so I'm interested in, and we actually talked about how it formed itself in the basement of the White House last night. How do you feel it's done so far?
Well, two observations. First of all, that I think all of us would agree, probably everybody in the room, that 100% protection is not achievable. We're talking about relative success. I mentioned to some people earlier that some years back I had Secret Service protection, and the head of the Secret Service came to our home and sat my wife and me down and said, the first thing he said was, if somebody decides to kill you, they will probably kill you. It's the only time I questioned running for president. He said, our job is to make it as difficult as possible. So I think that's the standard, is DHS doing everything within its powers, within the law, to make it as difficult as possible. Without having access to classified briefings and knowing exactly what's going on the inside, the answer is relatively yes. I mean, we're a lot better prepared than we were a decade ago, for sure. The second observation is the department's, at least from the standpoint 1,500 miles away, an administrative nightmare. I agree with the questioner yesterday who asked, shouldn't the department be reorganized? Isn't it possible to separate out the counterterrorism tasks and missions of the department from the routine border patrol, customs, and other missions? And the answer is yes. Is it going to happen? I doubt it. Congress would drag its feet. The administration doesn't want to go back and re-engineer the thing. But I think to make the department as effective as possible, that ought to be done.
Senator Talent, do you have a view on how DHS has done and whether it does need to be re-engineered in any, to any degree? There's been a suggestion that FEMA should be extracted and set up independently.
I would agree that you can't say the DHS experiment has been a success. I think the people, I mean, as a department. Now, a lot of good work is being done. And yes, I think we've done a lot since 9/11. It's almost ridiculous to say that we're doing the same thing we were doing then. I mean, this is a big nation and everybody's been energized. Again, the problem is we're not the only ones in the field here. I would identify the structural problems, and I think structure is the big problem here. It's several-fold. One of them is that, and I'll refer this to bio in particular. In the nuclear side of it, you know, the nuclear age began with a nuclear explosion. So everybody knew right from the beginning that nuclear had dangerous propensities, right? And our government's had generations to develop how it approaches nuclear issues. Bio is much more recent. And so we just have not, we've not mounted the learning curve enough to get a coherent structure in dealing with bio. There's like 24 presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed people with responsibility, part-time responsibility for bio, and nobody's fully in charge of it, okay? And that's just on the federal level. In addition, and I know that you felt the same way because your commission said the same thing, Congress has got to change the way it oversees DHS.
Absolutely.
Now, we were there, and you guys have been around this. The Congressional Oversight process can be tremendously constructive and helpful if it's done the right way. The Intel Committee is right, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, they really add to, on balance, to policy and development in those areas. But when you split up oversight among like literally 70 or 80 different committees and subcommittees, then all you get, the negative of oversight multiplied, the burden on the executive branch, the infighting, and you get no positive from it. So Congress has structurally made itself a negative, I would say, in this area. It's not everybody in it. I mean, individuals. That's a huge problem structurally, and we said that you all had been saying this for years, and it was time for them to actually fix it. So those are too big on the federal level. And then the other problem is that particularly with biopreparation, there's 4 different players. There's the federal government, state government, local government, and the private sector. And the principles we've outlined is they need to operate in partnership, not on an adversarial basis, because things actually have to be done. If the government just wants to stop things from happening, it can take an adversarial stance with but when things have to happen, you have to work with other groups, right? And then the leader, and there's always a question, who ought to lead? The level ought to lead that practically is best suited to leading in that area. So for example, with developing and stockpiling countermeasures, that's a federal private sector partnership. The federal government needs to be the leader in there. So there's all those issues to work out, but there's some big problems within the federal government, and I think DHS is part of that, and I would identify just who's in charge. I'll just add one thing. I think the top level people got to figure out a way to end run the structure, because you're not going to fix it in time. It'll take years to fix it. So they just need it's like if an artery's blocked, you flow the blood through capillaries until you can get an operation.
Marty, as you know, DHS has been constructed in this all-hazard sort of mode. It takes care of everything from the, natural disaster to the border problem to the CBRNE issues. A question is often asked, if you prepare for the CBRNE case, have you adequately prepared for everything else?
First answer is no, but we have here 2 very interesting observations. History always had small organizations trying to fight against nations. What is the difference? This is the first time in human history, that small organizations have the capacity of destructions that once was only in the hands of nations. This is what we're talking about over here. And that's a major shift. The second issue that we hear over here, we heard from the senators, how difficult is for the DHS to work? How difficult is it for him as an organization? Now, who the DHS is facing? He's facing organizations that their biggest asset is mobilization. The biggest asset is the fact that they can move very, very fast. So you take very fast and very creative and very innovative enemy. And I don't want to say Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda is misleading us, the idea that we keep saying Al-Qaeda, because we heard now they have only 500 people. And it's misleading us to think about it that way. But we are taking very creative, very fast, small organization, and we are putting in front of them a very complicated organization. Where I come from, I don't think that's the way you can win. And that's the reason that you have to create some kind of a shift in the way you operate against those kind of organizations. In front of a very fast organization, you put a faster organization, and you put an organization who's very smart and very intelligent.
Richard, I want to say that we know that Richard is going to have to leave us a little early, and so I'd like to offer you the opportunity to comment on that, and then I have one other follow-up.
On congressional oversight, of the 43 recommendations that the 9/11 Commission made in its final report, we recognized that the most difficult one to achieve was our recommendation for streamlining congressional oversight over the intelligence community, and particularly DHS. It's absolutely crazy quilt and crazy. I agree with Mike Leiter that the situation that confronted us on December 26th was a lot different than 9/11. And yes, there were echoes of the problems of connecting the dots and communications. But it was not the same, and I think there's been tremendous progress made. Having said that, you can't take the human element out of the equation. With respect to the Christmas Day attempt, you had human failures. Had the State Department recognized that Abdul Muttalib had a valid visa to travel to the United States, things would have been a lot different. And I think he would have, at a minimum, been intercepted for at least secondary screening. If we had secondary screening in Amsterdam, someone might have asked Abdul Muttalib why he was going to Detroit without an overcoat, and a bunch of other questions that might have clearly identified him as someone who should not be traveling on that plane. Let me mention a couple of other things. Clearly, the Christmas Day attempt was a wake-up call that we will be under attack for the immediate future. The analogy to a virus that will wax and wane is a good one in terms of dealing with the scourge of terrorism. We're doing better. A couple of observations. DNI, I think DNI is in flux. Our recommendation there, I think, has been among the most difficult systemic changes to make work. I think that DNI has to be rethought by the president. It hasn't operated as had been hoped. There are a bunch of reasons for it. There was huge resistance by the Department of Defense and CIA to try to strangle the baby in the crib. The president has to take leadership, but he has to define what DNI should be. In my view, and speaking only for myself, its primary mission should be one of interconnectivity among the intelligence community. One major thing that has been talked about over the last couple of days here, and I really have to commend Clark Ervin and the Aspen Institute for putting this together. It's been a tremendous learning experience for me. I really appreciate having been invited and participating. And that has to do with civil liberties and the issue of harnessing the tremendous capability we have to collect information, but our need is to assemble that information in some usable form for the best result for America. I was very active in terms of recommending during the Commission's hearings that we pay close attention to the question of civil rights and civil liberties. We need to have a dialogue in this country. We need to be able to harness the capability to utilize our technology in the most efficient way possible, while at the same time protecting our civil liberties. We can do that. And in 2004, the Congress created, as part of its reorganization laws, the legislation that creates a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. It was not a surprise that in the Bush administration this was a pretty feckless and useless group. President Obama has not yet appointed the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and I suggest that he should do so, and I suggest that this could be the vehicle from which we have an intelligent discussion within government about using our capability to mine information, to connect the dots, while at the same time protecting our civil liberties. And finally, let me just make one observation in terms of bandwidth and interoperability for our first responders. 9 years after 9/11, the FCC has still not provided dedicated bandwidth for our first responders. On 9/11, many, many of them died, whose death could and would likely have been avoided had the fire department and the police department been able to communicate with itself. It's high time that we got some action on that. It's shameful that we don't have it yet.
Richard, one of the issues that 9/11 Commission wrestled with was whether the current structure of government was appropriate for a counterterrorist mission, and specifically whether there needed to be any surgery or alteration in the FBI's role. Do you have a feeling now, with looking back, whether the decision effectively not to do anything with the FBI was the right decision?
I think it was. The FBI has struggled to perform its mission on the counterterrorism side. And I have a personal high regard for Director Mueller. And that being said, it is shameful that once again, the Senate Intelligence Committee, in its report on 9/11, on its report on the Christmas Day bombing, identified the fact that they still did not have the capacity for their IT to communicate within the organization itself. And therefore, one of the key analysts was denied access to intelligence that was in another place at the FBI. And it's shameful that we haven't fixed that problem. What I would look to here in terms of the growing threat of domestic terrorism is the example both in London and in 1994, the Atocha train bombing in Madrid, where 4 trains coming during the morning rush hour were attacked with some 13 explosive backpacks, bombs inside backpacks, causing significant death and injury among the Spanish population. Now, those attacks were not connected to Al-Qaeda. Those attacks were by foreigners, foreign nationals living in Spain who had come together in prison, arrested for street crime, and shared their radical views, became even more radicalized, supported themselves when they got out on selling drugs and street crime, and yet were able to coordinate an attack. The 4 trains were detonated within a space of 3 minutes. And this is a tremendous problem for us. Again, surface transportation, these kind of domestic attacks where the FBI has got to have primary responsibility, working hand in hand with state and local government. We can't rely on the incompetence of our adversary. We've been lucky in the last 2 big ones, in Times Square and the Christmas Day Northwest flight. But we can't rely on that. I talk about the cooperation between the New York PD, the CIA, the FBI, and the PVA in New York. PVA, the Pretzel Vendors Association. So here, we have to have a force multiplier. The FBI has to be on its toes. I do not think this country should have the equivalent of a secret police that has the mission. I think the FBI can do it, but this requires presidential leadership to stay on top of this situation and require the FBI to fulfill the mission I believe they are ultimately capable of performing.
No MI5.
No MI5.
Richard, thank you very much. I
Thank
know
you.
we've used all of your time, and I greatly appreciate your participation today. Safe travel.
Thank you. Good to see you.
I'd like to shift actually to another organizational issue. It's the federal structure of this great country, and both what the good and the other is with respect to defending the homeland. Obviously, the federal level brings enormous resources to bear on these issues. But there are 50 states and 8 territories and more than 3,000 counties in this country. And so it creates some complexities, to put it lightly. In operational planning, a military person always asks the question, who's in charge? And here in the United States, that can be a tough question in the case of a domestic disaster. And so I'm going to ask Senator Talent first if you believe that's a problem.
Yeah, although actually, this is it's a great question, and it's a good subject because I think it's an opportunity to highlight both some of the things we're doing better and some of the areas where we have problems. And let's do it in the context of bio, which I think we all agree is at least a very major threat, whether it's bigger than any of the others. Now, one of the advantages of dealing with bio rather than nuclear is that if you prepare well enough for it, you can take it off the WMD list. So if a nuclear bomb goes off, there's a limit to how much you can limit the damage, right? But if like we've stockpiled 300 million vaccines for smallpox. With our current distribution networks, we're close to eliminating smallpox as a weapon of mass destruction because we can vaccinate so quickly. If we can, then a lot of people don't die. Some people die, but not a lot, so it's not a weapon of mass destruction. You have this opportunity with bio, right? So the question is, how do you plan effectively and then respond quickly? Now, there are 4 links. You have to develop and stockpile the countermeasures. So you have to anticipate what you're going to need. You have to develop them. You have to be able to detect when an attack has occurred and to be situationally aware of how it's developing. Senator Hart mentioned the contagion idea. Okay, you get a few infected terrorists at a major airport. They infect 25 people there. They get on planes. You got to know who's sick in the country, and that is a real problem. And all you got to do is look what happened with H1N1. There was no time when the President of the United States could have gone to the CDC and said, how many people have H1N1 in this country, and they could have told them. They can't even tell you how many people died of it. Not with certainty, the kind of certainty that you need, and you got to have that. So you got to have detection, including situational awareness, then you got to distribute quickly and dispense the countermeasures, get them out quickly to people, and then you got to decontaminate afterwards. Now, our federal structure makes that difficult because the first is mostly federal, the stockpiling. The decontamination is also, I think, should be mostly federal. The middle two, because it's delivering a service to people, are heavily local and state. And so I think the leadership and planning ought to be federal, state and local in the middle two, and then federal at the end. But it's got to be a partnership, okay? And I'll just say in execution, when you actually respond, there's a constitutional imperative here. If you are responding to an attack, okay, the president, with his authority on the Constitution, is the ultimate authority. Now, should he delegate that to an individual local leader? I think it depends on who the attack has affected. If it's one city, 9/11 basically, and you have an effective leader there, then yeah, you delegate. Otherwise, if it's a like the disaster in the Gulf now, I think it ought to be federal. And I'll add one other comment to this. We can make our federal structure and our decentralized and fragmented society a positive, okay? Because all those decentralized and fragmented people are very dedicated, hardworking, ingenious people, and we can make it work for us if, and I think this has to be presidential, a sense of urgency will be imbued. We just declare what the nature of the threat is, so everybody says, wow, this is something we got to do something about, and then you empower people. And you can empower people. I'll give you a couple examples. The FBI, Richard was mentioning. We have fusion centers, which is federal and local intel sharing. Public health people are not part of the fusion centers. Why not? We can empower them. They got to be ready as part of this process. Why can't people who live in high-risk areas prepare themselves? I mean, we have med kits. We've done studies in my hometown of St. Louis. We've given people med kits, which had Cipro and that sort of stuff, and given them instructions about how to use them properly, and the test worked. So I really think we need to move down this so that the stuff's already out there. People are prepared in the event. We shouldn't be afraid to empower people. I think the attitude has to be, if we're going to have sins, they're going to be sins of commission, not omission with regard to this. A lot of other examples. If the federal government can fund the dollars to get rapid diagnostics, you can find out whether you're pregnant in a matter of minutes, right? It takes days to diagnose anthrax for certainty. Okay, so get these stockpiles, empower people, and then you make the structure work for us. But in terms of a response, You know, as a practical matter, if we're attacked, the president is going to decide, and he may decide he's in control, or he's going to delegate somebody. And if it's across jurisdictional lines, I think it functionally has to be federal.
Well, both you and Senator Hart have mentioned the bio threat as the major threat. So let's posit that there is a major biological attack on the country. A question would be, who is the Thad Allen for the bio case? I asked Senator Hart.
Well, overwhelmingly, the first responders, by definition, are going to be local. Emergency health workers, police, and fire, by and large. I'll circle around to the specific of your question, but there is an interesting constitutional issue here. Most Americans are not aware that the Constitution creates two armies. The second army, they're obviously the standing army, the professional army. Second army is what was called the militia, now the National Guard. And the commission I served on, the U.S. Commission on National Security, forecasting terrorist attacks, said that the backbone of Homeland Security had to be the National Guard. That comes from ancient Republican theory, small r, which says that we don't want the professional military enforcing the laws of the United States. We want citizen soldiers to do that. This goes back to Cincinnatus and the Athenian Republic. The problem is, Admiral, as you know, a big policy decision was made in the 70s, post-Vietnam, to make the National Guard a follow-on expeditionary force. So guess where the National Guard is now? It's in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is not in Denver, Colorado, or St. Louis, or somewhere else. Well, that's an overstatement. But instead of being here training and equipping for triage and confinement of an attack of any kind, the Guard is off fighting wars. And I think that's an enormous vulnerability. The National Guard is in military terms, forward deployed in the United States. They live in the communities. And now, in its wisdom, the Supreme Court says not only can the National Guard keep weapons in their closets, all the rest of us can. Separate issue, but that's part of the reason for the Second Amendment. I don't think there are enough doctors in Washington or in the National Health Service to deploy around this country. It is going to be up to the local emergency health workers. The question is, are they well enough trained right now? And this is the test and challenge of the federal system. In some cases they are. I've made a point of talking to the emergency health responders in Denver. They're ready to go. I don't know whether that's true in all the cities across this country.
Do you have a nomination for the Thad Allen for this particular scenario?
There are lots of talented Americans. Unfortunately, too many of them don't want to be in public service these days. That's a separate issue also.
If you're talking about response to an attack, I would think it'd likely be a public health official, and I think it would depend in part on where the attack was, who had the confidence. We're talking about now response, not planning. Right. Planning is a different kind of thing.
Yes.
I think you'd have to almost wait to see who it was. I don't disagree with anything you said, by the way, about the Guard and the local importance of the Guard. I'm just saying that because the Constitution also says, of course, the president can federalize under the Constitution. And in the event of this were an attack as opposed to a natural disaster occurring or an H1N1 thing, I think that's a decision the president would have to make.
I hope we can come back to both the planning issue and also the Guard. But first I want to ask Madi whether, looking at this country, you live in New York for some of the year at least, but you have seen a lot of the rest of the world. Do we have a particularly difficult circumstance here because of our federal system? And what would you do to prepare people here? Should we be issuing gas masks?
Well, I'm not going to talk about the federal system when I have two senators on my left. But I want to describe to all of you really what happens when such an event takes place. Communication systems fall down. You really don't have any situational picture knowing who is hurt and who is not hurt. You don't know what's happening in the hospitals. You actually don't know how many beds are there available. You're talking about chemical and biological. A person who just was damaged, let's say by a biological affection, and he runs into the hospital, he just at that moment destroyed all the hospital. So to think that the issue, I mean, this is a very, very complicated capabilities to be able to deal with it. And I'm not sure there are any clear-cut technologies and knowledge how to support it. And I know because I'm doing it around the world. It's a very complicated challenge. Everything collapses. And the most basic things, parents are looking for their children. Children are looking for the parents. Hospitals are going to be in a major chaos. So if you really want to prepare to such a challenge, you really have to make some very serious decision. That brings me to the part which makes me most worried. And that relates to the question of the resiliency of a nation. Because if we all agree that such a thing might happen, of course, we will pray that it will never happen, and we'll do whatever we can do to prevent it. But if we think it's going to happen, and if we understand now the kind of damage it can create and how difficult is it going to be to control the damage when it takes place, what is the country going to do about it in terms of how is the country, the US, is going to react to such an event? 9/11 took the US to 2 wars. What will a nuclear activity or a chemical activity going to do to the US? What is the American population going to think about their own country? What is the political leadership going to do? What else they can do? And more than that, what is the world going to think about America that is so easily exposed to such major events? So if I was in a place where I would take decisions, I would say right now, how do I really prepare myself deeply in terms of resiliency? How I will not allow devastating events change the way I live, change my civil rights, change my politics, change my policy. Someone has to define it right now before it happens. Because after it happens, we all like to think that we control the situation. History is a force of nature. That's right. It's stronger than all of us here. And it might take a great country to the wrong place. So you have to design the blueprint. It's not a fun discussion because basically, I sell $7 billion of technology a year around the world, and I'm telling you I don't have this technology for such a year, so it will be a great discussion to sit over here. Yeah, we can deal with it. But because I don't think that right now anyone can really deal with such a disaster, prepare a blueprint. How is my country going to deal when it's going to happen? Not to prepare it after it, because then it takes you to directions that you really didn't want to go.
One advantage, Steve, this is one of the few truly bipartisan or nonpartisan issues left in Washington. We didn't encounter any of that in our discussions. I also want to say it's owing, especially since this is taped, because I think I made a comment earlier that can be construed as attacking the Congress, and I meant to institutionally. However, the House Homeland Security Committee and the Senate Government Reform Committee are exceptions to that, and we said that in our report. They're both moving important pieces of legislation. They're really doing their best. The House just moved a very good bill. And I think a couple of the House staffers, great people, are here today, and I didn't want you all to think I was indicting Mr. Thompson and Mr. King and Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman with the rest of them. So I put that on the tape now.
Senator Talent, I'd like to follow up a little, though, on this issue of preparation. It's what Madi has talked about, but I lived through a period right after 9/11 when Governor Ridge was trying to sell the nation on duct tape, and only got him a couple of titles on an invitation to the Jay Leno show. Your proposed method of, preparation is the means of prevention requires a buy-in from the American people. And I think in the case of the smallpox issue, it's been shown that pre-vaccination of at least, some cohort of people is important for that to work properly.
Well, these med kits should clearly be made available to first responders, which you guys both talked about. Then the med kits contain the basic drugs that we do have available to deal with the most likely. There's like eight pathogens that most people think are going to be the ones, although, they can, with DNA adapters and this sort of thing now, you can't ever be certain. But look, we know that the chains in the link of resiliency in a bio case, it's stockpiling, I mentioned before, detection, along with situational awareness, distribution, dispensing, and then decontamination. Some areas we've shown that the distribution part, there's a cities initiative, about 55% of the population is covered by stockpiles of drugs that have been distributed. And the government has tested some pretty promising plans for how to help localities dispense it on 2 tracks. Localities doing it in their own locally adapted way, and then the federal government doing it. But we got to fund that better. But we're behind in the others. Some of it is funding, some of it is a lack of authority. Or in a fragmented decision making. But I think, again, the context is urgency presidentially communicated, unifying decision making. Bob Graham and I suggested, not in the report, but afterwards, that the office of the vice president ought to be put in charge of all this on the federal level. I think we said bio, but it could be more than that. We have a vice president now who actually has a history in the Congress of dealing with this, but we meant it institutional, because there's only 2 people that cabinet secretaries say sir to, or ma'am, right? The president, the vice president. So that would be a step ahead. But it's the old problem in our political system. The urgent keeps crowding out the important. And this is both urgent and important.
I'd like to come back to something that Marty said about the confusion, the turmoil that occurs when there is a major disaster. In the military, we have a term called the fog of war. And even though the military is generally credited with having a very well-designed and repetitively used planning system in which we actually designate individuals as military planners, and they have an entire career devoted to that discipline. We educate them, we train them, and the whole system is built on having a plan when you start an operation. But all military commanders also know that a good plan generally doesn't last 24 hours past the beginning of an operation. And that's what creates the fog of war. But in the domestic circumstance, the complexity is multiplied many times over that, I would argue, for the military case. So my question for the panelists is, how are we doing on the domestic side for a planning system for domestic response to a serious attack?
The fallacy of not your question, but the question for the topic is, are we prepared? We are, it depends on who we are. We are 300 million people in a mass democracy. Some are better prepared than others. I don't think you can generalize about a uniform status of preparedness or responsiveness across this country. For a long period of time, I couldn't walk down the streets of New York without being stopped by people saying, when are we going to be hit again? They didn't mean the United States. They meant the city of New York. And as I think all of us know, the city of New York is incredibly prepared compared to the rest of the country. I had the occasion of, in a different capacity, of recently touring the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. If you want to, I mean, we don't want to give the terrorists any ideas here as if they couldn't figure it out themselves. But if you want to see a vulnerable facility, visit the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's virtually indefensible. 5 minutes from LAX, 3 private marinas embedded in the ports, cruise ship lines, tens of thousands of semi-trailer trucks coming and going. It just defies protection. So these sweeping kind of questions about are we prepared, what's the level of preparation, it has to be incident specific, I think. And I'd just like to finish up with a little bit, just comment on the concept of resilience. Senator Talent has used it, others have used it. It's an idea I associate most of all with a former Coast Guard commander, Steve Flynn, who has written on the subject, and I encourage you to get his books. Flynn's thesis is if Al-Qaeda or the enemy knows that there is a backup system, say for the critical infrastructure, the computer systems for transportation or finance or energy or communications, that if they take down that system within hours, a backup system will be in place. That takes away a lot of the incentive for going to a lot of trouble to shut that system down. Same is true of energy distribution and all the rest of it. And I think that it applies across the board. Now, we can't have duplicate systems for everything in this country. Separate hospitals to replace this one if it gets blown up or whatever. But there is a lot to be said for having the capability to put a down capability back in operation locally, nationally, or wherever, as a means of deterring people from trying to destroy it. And by the way, almost all of bin Laden's statements have to do, virtually all of them, not with how many Americans he wants to kill, but the destruction or degradation of the U.S. economic system.
They see the world, they have a better strategic view of the world than we do, and a better strategy. So we win the battles, but are we going to win the war? We tend to still view the world in terms of nations and national boundaries, and they understand the world is a set of systems. It's financial, transportation, communications. And you can attack, and their enemies depend on those systems a lot more than they do, and those systems are hard to defend. And that's what they attack, rather than locations, but so much. I would say in terms of preparation, this is talent here. I think Bob Graham would probably agree with this, at least in gross, that the failure to stockpile the countermeasures is a huge problem. And I don't know why they're not funding it. We have 2 programs, BioShield and BARDA, they're called, and they're getting funded at 10% of what they should be, and they keep attacking that funding, trying to take it used for something else. Incredibly frustrating. We don't have the linkages. There are a lot of good state and local systems for health reporting, but we haven't linked them together, and it's very spotty out there, and I'm really concerned, particularly with a contagious disease as opposed to like an anthrax, which at least isn't contagious, that we're just not going to know what the situation is. And if we don't know what the situation is, you can't deal with it. It's ridiculous in this country that we have some epidemic, natural or man-caused, and the top leaders don't know who's sick. We're nowhere on decontamination. And this can be a huge problem. You put anthrax in the New York subway system, even if you minimize the impact on the people, you got to decontaminate, you got to get that out of there, or you can't use the New York subway system. Well, that's like saying you just shut down New York, right? And this is what they want to do. It isn't even so much people. And we're not where we need to be there. I would just say one other thing, and Richard touched on this. We've got so many good people, and many of them are prepared, the first responders, et cetera. But we have not dealt with how they can link together for mutual support. He mentioned bandwidth. That's an issue. The fact that we have all these health reporting systems that are not linked together. We don't have good organizational directories so they know what capabilities others have. And this is an area a lot of that is funding. This is an area the federal government could help with funding. So those are the major gaps. And the problem is with bio or any of these things, it's a link in the chain, and if there's any one of them that's broken, the chain won't. If you don't have the countermeasures, it doesn't matter how good a distribution system you've got. You can't help people.
Right. I will have to say that the military mind still comes back to the notion that if you have well-established plan that has, in fact, got in place those issues of linkage of relationships, because you defined a chain of command, and I realize that in the domestic case it's not so easy, but you define the resources required and the means to get them there, and it's in fact a standing plan. It appears to me that we have not yet at the federal level established the planning mechanism for that kind of thorough treatment of the potential for a domestic disaster.
You're right. There is no plan.
Right.
There are plans, which is what Senator Hart was saying, but there is no plan.
I know we're close to the time where we need to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions, but I want to just mention one thing and ask Monty's comment, because it relates to this issue of complexity, and we're actually seeing this in the Gulf oil spill at the moment, which is, how do you provide for the incorporation of international assistance? We all saw what occurred in Haiti, and actually the difficulties involved in descending on a country with, substantial assets and no immediate means to coordinate that. But actually, that could be an issue in this country. And I think until Katrina, the United States had never accepted outside assistance. But we now have been offered substantial assistance in the case of the Gulf oil spill, and my understanding is that hasn't gone smoothly. But it seems to me that international assistance is something that all of us globally need to understand how to do and do efficiently.
I agree. I think that the free world is to start thinking about coalitions, and a coalition for preparedness, and coalition how to deal with something, with a major event, and to be able to support that coalition, which is going to be practical forces that know how to deal with very complex environment. What is the complex environment? Everything that happens in complex, we have to look at it almost in the mathematical tools. In a complex environment, and that's what's going to happen in a biological event, nothing is going to be predictable when it happens. Something happens, and you're going to think that here is the next thing which is going to happen, but basically this is not the next thing which is going to happen. The next thing is going to happen over here. I'm going to say something which I'm going to say it in a very careful way. 9/11, and I was in New York when it happened. I think New York has the best fire department in the world. They are well equipped. They have stations almost in every location. They are the most motivated people I ever met. Many real heroes. And yet, when something happened that they were not used to it, they had a very big challenge. And they didn't really know how to deal with that challenge. And you're talking about the best fire department, you're talking about the best structured organization in the world. Think about bigger events, what might happen.
This is why the Congressional Oversight thing, and we laugh at this, because everybody laughs at the Congress, okay? This is a real problem, because to plan requires that somebody take authority, okay? And whoever takes the authority is going to be accountable. And if you want them to exercise the authority with the kind of freedom and discretion that they should use, they got to know to whom they're going to be accountable, who they got to clear it with. And they don't in this area, not from the congressional side, and to some extent not from the executive side. I mean, if the chief of naval operations needs to do something and he's worried about congressional oversight, there's like 4 people that he has to talk to. And so we really ran into this. This is a problem, and it's going to take somebody, I think, in the House or the Senate, who just decides that they're going to impose institutional pain until it's fixed. We saw this with the campaign finance bill. Whether you liked that or didn't like it, it was a revolt against the leadership, and they just caused such problems that they had to pass it, right? So I think something like this is going to have to happen, and I'm taking opportunities like this to say it, because we're looking for leaders within the bodies who will stand up and just say, okay, you know what? The turf problems are a problem, but everybody else is having to adjust to this, and we're going to have to adjust too.
Well, we only made partial progress through our CBRNE list, but I think it's the right time to open this up to questions. I'd like to ask that you wait until the microphone gets there, and you actually only pose a single question, and I'll start over here with this gent.
Well, I just first want to say thanks a lot for, I think, really bringing the biological weapon aspect to the attention of everyone here. My name's Andy Kiliansky, and I'm a graduate student in microbiology. And I work with the virus that causes SARS. Now, most of you remember that in 2003, there's a major SARS outbreak in Asia. And fortunately, that was relatively well contained. Now, as a graduate student, I have access to live SARS virus, and SARS has a 10% mortality rate. It's very contagious. And I think this really just brings to the issue that, as a nation, we are very susceptible to one or two, or someone like me can pose a very large danger to the population. And I think it's very important that we address how easy and how effective a tactic like a biological weapon would be for a terrorist group.
Is there a question there?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm getting to that.
All right.
I just kind of wanted to ask, you said, there's not really a plan that we have in place, and we have multiple plans. At what level do you interface with the scientific community, more specifically the CDC, the NIH, when coming up with some of these contingency plans that might be put in place if this were to happen?
Anyone like to?
It's hugely important. I mentioned in bio, there's federal, state, local, and private sector, which is for-profit, nonprofit, and particularly the scientific community. And they've come a long way. Again, I mentioned before that if you were in nuclear science, from the minute you start studying it, doing what you're doing, everybody, there's security issues involved in this. Most life scientists out there, I mean, they're having to learn this. That security is a big concern, and they're adapting pretty well. But it needs to be a partnership. As a matter of fact, this bill that the House just brought out, I think, has a very important provision in it because it unifies the regulations of high containment labs, which is a really good thing. But it unifies them under control of HHS rather than DHS. And that is primarily because the conclusion is going to be easier for HHS to learn security than it is going to be for DHS to learn science. And if you don't learn the science and you don't partner with a scientist, this thing is not going to work. Okay, so there's an example of the partnership principle. DHS is involved in it. Okay, so it's hugely important. We're trying to decide now what to stockpile and how you do it. That's a scientific community thing. And we're going to beat this, and I hope we do, and through partnerships like that. So yeah, it's very important.
Yes, sir, in the blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Robert Myers, and I represent the Advocate Hospital System in Chicago, which is the largest delivery system in Chicago. My question is, what do we know about the stockpiles of weaponized smallpox virus created by the Soviets during the 1980s? And do we know if these have been genetically altered to be resistant to the smallpox vaccines which we have now?
That, I would suggest, is probably a question that none of the panelists will have detailed information about, and if they did, it probably couldn't be shared.
Right. Exactly.
So
We all know the answers, but it's classified,
yes.
so we can't tell you.
I could just say that yes, and yes, there were substantial issues on both of those questions that you raised.
Yeah, Admiral would know.
And leave it at that. Here.
There is some concern with bio as a state, with state agents doing it, but it's not that great a battlefield weapon, which is originally how it was thought of, because it takes too long to work. But
Roger London, American Security Challenge. So if this young man here who now has an FBI jacket took some SARS to Atlanta, since that's where CDC is, and infected a great deal of Atlanta, and Hartsfield had to shut down. There's a lot of industry there, Coca-Cola, Turner, AT&T, et cetera. is FEMA, aside from the healthcare issue, is FEMA and the FAA and TSA positioned organizationally in command structure and planning to manage the problems of the business continuity and the transportation issues and bringing energy and power into the city?
Comments from any of the panelists?
Synthesize the question.
The question had to do with a complex biological attack on Atlanta that involved the commerce of the city substantially coming to a halt, right, and therefore involving many of the elements of government that need to deal with those issues. And is there a plan that would address that?
Well, this whole business of planning gets very confusing in the sense, I don't think we're ever, given the nature of this country, going to have a federal plan, a one-size-fits-all, Atlanta, Denver, Cleveland, Dallas, etc. The best the expert laboratories and agencies can do is suggest guidelines, provide as much detailed information that local authorities in any of these cities might not have, and then urge, insist that the local command authority in the city of Denver adapt that information and those guidelines to the peculiar situation of that city. But if when we talk about is there a plan, some big blueprint in the Department of Homeland Security that can then be delivered to the state of Colorado, city of Denver, or any place else, I don't think that day's going to happen.
And I would agree with that. And to try and address the thrust of it, particularly when dealing with bio. Remember, the states and the localities have been planning to deal with epidemics of various kinds for a long time, and there's a big crossover. One of the advantages, by the way, of preparing for a bio attack is we'll have a lot stronger public health infrastructure to deal with H1N1 and the rest of it. I mean, there is a big overlap. How good the planning is to deal with that, as Senator Hart was saying, depends a lot on where you are. I don't know about Atlanta. There's a general agreement that New York is doing very well, that Chicago, by the way, has really turned things around, because Mayor Daley, a few years ago, got heavily involved in it, and then things turned to turn around in Chicago when he gets heavily involved in it. I don't know about Atlanta. On a federal level, since 9/11, each of those agencies should have people designated to try and consider and figure out how they're going to work with localities in dealing with that. We haven't studied at that granular level to say, is FAA ready to deal with the air? But those who have do not have high confidence levels, okay? So I can't sit here and tell you that I think we're ready. There are definite areas where we have found big gaps in the chain of resilience. But having said that, we are better off. I mean, we have done a lot more than we had done, as of 9/11. Would you all agree with that? Is that fair?
One way to answer your question is to drill.
Yeah.
I mean, the military does drills. I've often wondered what would happen, pardon me for my hometown bias, if the mayor of Denver had an alarm clock set to 3 in the morning. He picks up the phone, he calls the chief of police and the head of the fire department and says, there is a weapon of mass destruction in a downtown high-rise building in Denver, and it's going to go off in 8 hours. And then start his stopwatch. Now, you can't do that for obvious reasons. You're going to panic everybody, including the police and the firemen. But it would be kind of instructional.
And it would be interesting to see. It would be interesting to see how well they've done in Denver. I mean, it's very spotty. This, by the way, is a good way to find out who ought to be in charge, because a lot of local and even governors don't have the kind of experience that military people or national security people have in going through these war room type exercises. And if you're going to have governors in charge of it, now some of them do, but then you ought to go through this so that they learn how to make decisions in that kind of a context. That they may have to locally. There's some kind of local, disaster, some kind of threat, but they haven't all been through that the way, Pentagon and national security people routinely do.
I see Secretary Chertoff has got a hand up. We may, depending on what he asks, we may invite him up into the
Yeah,
chair.
exactly.
And I am.
You're going to answer your own question.
I was
so be
actually
careful.
going to take the privilege of, as my friend Mike McConnell used to say, I have some guilty knowledge. So I thought what I might do is lay out a little bit of the answer to the prior question and then pose a proposition to the panel and hear the panel's reaction. The way planning is currently operated under Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5 is it does take place under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security, and it brings together at the federal level all of the operational agencies. There are somewhere between 15 and 20 basic scenarios that we plan against. And as I think somebody said, I think maybe it was Senator Hart, we do a national strategy, a national plan, and then it flows down to an agency plan and then ultimately to state and locals who have to agree that they want to invest the time and effort into doing the planning. And they vary, frankly, depending on where they are. We've done probably a lot with respect to the Gulf on hurricanes because they're used to dealing with that. Probably in the bio area, it's been a little hard to get some of the local public health authorities. The key difference between the military and the civilian domain is there is no command and control, and under our constitutional system, there can't be. So what it is a combination of coordinated planning, training, and exercising. As Senator Hart said, it's about drilling, and the more drilling you do, the better the coordination is. It's a little bit like fielding a baseball team. The manager doesn't sit there and yell out, catch the ball, throw it to the second baseman, throw it to the first baseman. You train over and over again, and then when the ball comes to the third baseman, he knows what to do. So it's an incident management process, not a command process. But bouncing off on that, I'd like to come to a statement that was made earlier when people were asking the question about how DHS is configured. And I'm going to put a proposition, and I'd be curious as to your reaction. Somebody said that we ought to separate out the counterterrorism mission from the routine missions. I'd like to suggest to you that actually that's exactly wrong. That if you look at the question of how you broaden the flow of information and how you network and engage the broadest number of people in a counterterrorism mission, the answer is to integrate that mission with day-to-day activity. For example, in policing, and if Bill Bratton's here, he may comment on this. The essence of what you want to do with your police department is not only have counterterrorist police. You want to build counterterrorism into the portfolio of every single beat policeman. Likewise, from DHS's standpoint, the fact that the Border Patrol agent or the border inspector or the TSA inspector or the Coast Guard cutter captain has counterterrorism in his or her portfolio means that every time they have a benign encounter or an apparently benign encounter, they are tuned to look for the anomaly that suggests it's something more serious. So I'd argue if you want to get better information sharing and you want to get the benefit of network and nimbleness in the field, what you actually want to do is integrate counterterrorism as part of the portfolio of responsibilities across the board of a large group of people. So I throw it out there. I wanted to do it now as opposed to when I speak last, so I gave people the right of reply.
And I offer the opportunity for a rebuttal.
That sounds brilliant. And one of the things I mentioned, I didn't get a chance to say in response to what Richard said. Yes, we have issues in the intel community. There's no question. But one of the things they have done in the last few years is to change culture through those kinds of techniques, understanding how things actually operate at desks day to day. And rather than trying to change hierarchical or systematic structure, to do the kinds of things that change incentives so that people naturally begin working together. We found that a lot of that has happened in the intelligence community in our report. Now, there are certainly gaps and problems, and that's the kind of thing that will allow Homeland to work together over time. I would add also, it would be very important to try and do that in public health offices around the country, because one big problem here you have is the states are all short on money now. They're cutting public health. And if you're an average public health officer, your day-to-day duties don't include preparing for an anthrax attack. And that, you just look on that as taking away from your ability to deal with the pressing problems that you're overwhelmed with already. So we've got to figure out a way to get them as involved and integrated as that would do in DHS.
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to take the prerogative, even though I don't know whether I'm entitled to this as a moderator, to push back some on the point you make regarding planning. It relates to this issue that because of our federal system, we simply are unable to conduct the kind of planning that we would like to do if we were going to truly address how to deal with a major domestic catastrophe. And so I, like all of you, watch us clean oil off of brown pelicans and the country get gripped with the damage that's occurring down there. And I ask myself, if it were television pictures of citizens with radiation burns and contamination, what would be the tolerance of the argument that our system didn't permit us to do the planning that we needed to do? And so I believe that the action that's required is to get all of the branches of government and all of the elements of the problem, including federal, state, local, etc., involved in determining what we need to do to make it work, to be able to plan. And actually, I believe there is some progress in this regard. I'll give you an example. There was, in fact, a mandate that required state emergency managers to produce plans, and there was a program instituted, I think by Paul McHale, to get Army Guard assistance to those state emergency managers to create those plans. Now, here's one of the curiosities of the federal system. Only some of the states have completed those plans, and not all of them will share them, either with their neighboring state or with the federal government, for a variety of reasons. And my view is it would be a mistake for this country to wait until we have a major WMD incident to decide that we need to then take the step to force us to have a planning system that would deal with what I would call the fog of domestic disaster.
Admiral, for your principle to work, people have to have confidence in government. And at no time in my life has citizen confidence in their government been lower.
Right.
It's a huge issue. There are practical as well as legal issues, Stafford Act issues. In theory, you can change the legal issues. There are a lot of people in Congress who would raise objections on the practical basis, which is you're going to have to work through, and this anything that's service delivery, you're going to have to work through state and local agents. Now, if you are trying to impose a hierarchical system legally, in essence subvert what they see as their sovereignty and independence, although constitutionally you could do it probably, they're going to resent that. So it has to be, I mean, I'm agreeing with you, but it has to be done by changing their incentives and their purposes and their motives so they want to do it, which we have done to some extent. I'll just say also, this is a big problem in DOD. If you talk to DOD about Homeland Defense participation, they don't know who's in charge either when they come in because of exactly this.
I'm afraid I've gotten the hook, and I need, first of all, to thank the Aspen Institute and the corporate sponsors and all of you today for this energetic discussion on a very serious issue for this country, and to thank our panelists for what I think was a very good discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for your sponsor.
Well, I'm going to be here through about 11 o'clock tomorrow.